Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Lohman, and I'm a food historian. And today we're going to be talking about a brief history of cookbooks and recipes. I say brief because there's so many different directions that one can go with this. So I had to pick and choose a little bit, but we're going to be talking about a lot of firsts and also about a lot of changes, how cookbooks and recipes evolved over time. Now, I came to the subject of this talk because in my work as a food historian, I work with a lot of recipes. Actually, I have two books out. My first book came out in 2016. That's 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine. And I look at how flavors and different ingredients came into American kitchens and stayed over time. And my second book, Endangered Eating, America's Vanishing Foods, this book is about foods on the verge of extinction in this country. And in both of these books, I looked to historic cookbooks and food resources to understand how what we eat here in America has evolved over time. And I got really interested in how cookbooks and recipes themselves have evolved over time. I think we think about recipes as being pretty standardized today, although I'm sure we all have memories of working with a recipe that didn't quite work out and wondering why. So I'm going to not only show you these cookbooks, talk about the cuisine, but also read you some recipes from the past, starting with the beginning, so you can see how we write about food and how we address recipes has changed over time. So what you're looking at on your screen is actually a small section of some of my cookbooks, my cookbook collection. My earliest original goes back to the 1830s, but I've got replicas from way before that too. And then I, of course, have contemporary cookbooks as well from writers that I really, really love. So we're going to be looking at a lot of examples from my own collection, but also a lot of examples that predate that too. So let's begin at the beginning. What you're looking at here are 2 cuneiform tablets. Cuneiform is a writing system that are from 3000 BC. That's about 5,000 years ago. These tablets are from Mesopotamia, and these tablets contain recipes that are offerings to gods. So this isn't something that you would make in your kitchen every day, probably, although the recipes sound pretty simple. These are the first recipes known on the planet. As we move through this, you're going to see a lot of our early cookbooks come from the Arabian Peninsula and from Italy. So 2 cultures that are extremely passionate about food. So this is also, I would say shortly after, but at least 6,000 years after the invention of agriculture. But agriculture has been credited to have begun in Mesopotamia, at least what we understand of as modern agriculture. So in some ways it might make sense that we have a written language that's expressing recipes in this place as well. So let me read you one of these recipes from here. I have to say that there are broken and damaged passages. There's unknown vocabulary, technical languages. There's only theories about what some of the ingredients are, mostly because they probably had a different name for it. So here's a recipe for a pigeon stew. Split the recipe in half, add other meat, prepare the water, add fat and salt to taste, breadcrumbs, onion, samadou, leeks, garlic. First soak the herbs in milk. When it is cooked, it is ready to serve. Samadou, they think might be like semolina flour, but nobody is really sure. Maybe like as a thickener, since there's also breadcrumbs going in there. It's just a piece of prose. It's a really simple recipe. It's designed for someone who already knows how to cook. It's a little vague, add other meats, but I do love that last line. When it is cooked, it is ready to serve. I mean, it does tell you something that this is a hot dish that you're going to serve fresh, off the open fire. And so there is some beauty into it, even though it's not necessarily as clear or also as restrictive as contemporary recipes. Now, the next cookbook that we know about, we're going to be in manuscript cookbooks for a while. So the cuneiform tablets were actually clay tablets. And now for another 1,000 years, we have handwritten manuscripts. The earliest one that's known is a Roman tablet from the 1st century AD. It's called De Re Coquinaria. You'll have to excuse some of my Latin pronunciation, but that means on the subject of cooking, and it's written by a man named Apicius. Now, our earliest cookbook were temple offerings. For a while in this manuscript phase, these are recipes that are documented by men for other male cooks that are designed to satisfy the wealthiest and most lordly households. So we're talking about like court chefs, which professional chefs at the highest levels in the Middle Ages tended to be men. Although women were cooking in taverns, women were sort of cooking at like takeout stands. Restaurants officially didn't really exist until the 1900s, but there were other public venues where people were cooking food, and women were doing a lot of that work. But on the highest levels, it was men cooking for royal families and writing down their recipes for other royal households with male chefs. It's a really fascinating book. I'm going to read you one recipe in English. This is a hot kid that's a baby goat or lamb stew. Put the pieces of meat into a pan. Finely chop an onion and coriander, pound pepper, lovage, cumin, garum. Garum is like a Roman fish sauce, oil and wine. Cook, turn out into a shallow pan, thicken with wheat starch. If you take lamb, you should add the contents of the mortar while the meat is still raw. If kid, add it while it is cooking. So in both of these early recipes, they add this sort of, it's directions, but it's more like advice at the last minute, which, you know, you've probably read the whole recipe, but if you're cooking along, you would have been like, oh, shoot, I should have added the contents of my mortar earlier. But, you know, you can tell that this is a lovely seasoned recipe. Lovage, cumin, garum, the fish sauce gives it a deep, like meaty umami flavor, wine, the coriander for some brightness. I mean, it sounds pretty decent eating. You've probably noticed that both of them too are both stews. Cooking gets more complicated when our cooking tools get more complicated. So when we're basically cooking over open fires, it's a lot of stews, a lot of basic breads. Around the same time, we also see a cookbook from Baghdad. So again, I said a lot of these early books are from Italy and the Arabian Peninsula. We kind of go back and forth and back and forth. This book is known in like the English modern translation is simply as Baghdad Cookery, but its full name is The Annals of the Caliph's Kitchen. It was designed to serve religious leaders in Baghdad known as caliphs, but unlike the reason why there's so much good food coming out of the Arabian Peninsula is that the Islamic faith didn't oppress bodily desires in the same way that Christianity did in Europe. So gluttony is a sin. So we don't see a lot of these early cookbooks coming out of Europe really for that reason. Whereas in the Arabian Peninsula, you are supposed to delight in the cuisine and the pleasures of the physical world. So they would throw caliphs, high religious leaders, as well as lords, kings in the region, would throw these really legendary opulent banquets. They loved coloring foods with saffron. They loved sprinkling things with sugar for the sparkle. And in fact, a lot of our culture of sweets comes from the Arabian Peninsula. It's coming from Persia, most specifically. So let's read a recipe from here. Okay, so actually I've made a few out of this book, which is fun. So if I've ever made some of these recipes, I'm showing you photos of what I actually worked on. And I was so fascinated by this cookbook that I threw my own party. I wouldn't call it opulent, but I did make a few things. The top slide there, these are big pieces of flatbread. And then there's chicken and walnuts and cilantro over it. So like pretty basic, not too shocking. And then on the other one, you roast a chicken over top of like sugar and apricots. And then underneath that is a piece of flatbread. So then you sort of serve the roast chicken, and then the flatbread and the apricots, the dried apricots, have soaked up all the roasting juices from the chicken. So you have this like, it's kind of like a Yorkshire pudding, like it's sopping up all of those juices and is really, really delicious. Some rose water thrown in here as well. So now we're going to come, a couple hundred years forward in time. There are a few manuscripts that have popped up here and there before this, but this one is significant because the Forme of Cury is the first cooking manuscript in English. There are a couple copies of this that still exist. It was copied like at least 20 odd times, and there's one in the Morgan Library that they occasionally bring out for display in New York City. So the Forme of Cury is a 14th century cooking manual. We don't know exactly when it's from because we don't know which one is the original. It's done on vellum, and there are about 200 recipes, but that changes from copy to copy. And it's the same thing as Dira Culinaria in that this was a cooking manuscript designed for the highest households. The people who originally wrote it claimed to be cooks for the King of England. And then it was copied and then spread out to other lordly households so that they could be eating the same foods as the king. Another fascinating book in that it's the first cooking manuscript to mention certain ingredients like cloves, olive oil, mace, and also gourds. We don't have American squash yet, but there is an Asiatic gourd that was used in Europe before first contact with the Americas. There's also very valuable spices included in this: nutmeg, caraway, ginger, pepper, and cardamom. These are all spices that are coming from the East, from China, Indonesia, India, and would be very expensive to have in your kitchen. And so all of the foods are just absolutely covered with these spices. It's like conspicuous consumption. Now, I have made a few foods from the Forme of Cury. On the right-hand side there is an applesauce that is colored with saffron, much like they were doing in Baghdad a couple hundred years before. There is a pork tenderloin that is covered in a combination of spices that today we sort of separate the idea of sweet and savory spices, but this pork tenderloin has black pepper, it has cinnamon, it has cardamom, it's cooked with leeks, and honestly, it was really, really, really pretty delicious. I'm going to read another recipe for sauce madame. Take sage, parsley, hyssop, savory, quinces and pears, garlic and grapes, and stuff the geese therewith. That always gets me because they don't mention the geese at top. I don't expect the geese to be in there. Sew the hole that no grease comes out and roast them well, and keep the dripping that falleth thereof. Take meat jelly and dripping and add in a posset. When the geese be roasted enough, take and smite and cut them into pieces, and that is within, and add in a posset and put therein wine if it be too thick. And thereto powder of galangal, powder douce. Galangal is a relative of ginger. Powder douce is like a pre-blended kitchen spice that you make in your own home. And salt, and boil the sauce and dress the geese in dishes and lay the sauce onward. Additionally, this also contains some pretty wild recipes: salad for one, but also fermenti with porpoise, which is a wheat and milk gruel kind of soup drink that is served with slices of porpoise, the sea mammal. It's to do with early Catholicism, in that modern Catholicism, you eat on Fridays, maybe not over Lent, but there were a lot more fast days historically where you weren't supposed to be eating meat. But they also declared that any animal that spent enough time in water was a fish. So porpoises were fish, beavers were fish, certain types of water birds were fish. And this was really for the rich people so they could have opulent banquets, and the poor people did not. This is just to show you, this is another version of the Forme of Cury that's kind of in a book form as opposed to a rolling scroll. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the Arabian Peninsula. We've talked about Europe. We are going to go actually to Mongolia. Today, I believe this book would have come out of modern day China, but we're talking about the height of the Mongol Empire in 1330. This book, and again, excuse my pronunciation, is called the Yin Sheng Zheng Yao. And that translates to essential knowledge for drinking and feasting. The Mongol Empire, they're often portrayed as like barbarians, but they were extremely sophisticated, and their empire covered so many different cultures that they loved entertaining people from far and wide, sort of at the central seat of the empire, and feeding them really sophisticated foods, both from Mongol culture, but often from the culture of the visitors, whether this was a conquered culture or people coming all the way from Europe too. Basically, their trade routes and their knowledge were so far reaching that they were making these really complicated international dishes. And part of Mongol culture was to be this exquisite and impressive host. So here is a recipe. This is for mastic soup Mastic is a tree sap that is both chewy and has its own flavor as well. There is a little bit of both Eastern and Western has this idea of humors. And so it talks about in this book, they put food in the context of health. So it talks about that it's a warming soup. And so you take mutton, cardamom, cinnamon, chickpeas, and you boil the ingredients together to make a soup. Again, very simple instructions, make a soup. It's kind of like that part in Bake Off where they get the thing that only has some instructions. That's all historical cookbooks. You're going to strain the broth. You're going to add 2 more ounces of cooked chickpeas, a pint of rice, and an ounce of mastic. Adjust flavors with salt to taste. Love that. Add the meat and garnish with cilantro. So again, a really interesting soup that I haven't made. This is a type of Mongol meat soup that was fairly common. So it's also influenced by soups that come from further west. They're kind of generally referred to as Near Eastern, a soup called harissa that has been in cooking manuscripts from that era for already a couple hundred years. Interestingly, the book also describes how to make arak. Arak is distilled palm wine as well. So this is a really early sort of alcohol recipe, really early distilling recipe too. And it's kind of interesting. The spicing is pretty light. They use a lot of herbs too, but kind of in a pleasant way. And the combination is usually cinnamon, cumin, and black pepper. So now we come back to Europe and we come back to Italy. This is the first printed cookbook. The name in actually in Latin. It was considered like Latin was for scholars, Italian was for everybody else. The book is called De Honesta Valutate e Valetudina, and it's written by Bartolomeo Platina, but it's actually written by a chef called Maestro Martino de Rossi. And basically, he does give some credit to De Rossi, but Platina's name is only known today as the one who wrote this cookbook and printed it. Interestingly, on Platina's deathbed, he doesn't even list this among the most important cookbooks that he's written, although it's the one that like he's now most well known for because it's one of our earliest cooking documents. So De Rossi was one of the most influential cooks in Italy during the Renaissance. And he basically is credited with creating contemporary Italian cuisine. Now, this is really still before tomatoes are inducted into Italian food, but a lot of the other basics are still here. But then also foods that we wouldn't consider a part of contemporary Italian cuisine are in here. For example, there's a very medieval and Renaissance dish of a peacock where you cook the meat, you skin the peacock, you save the skin and the feathers, you cook the meats, and then you put the meat back inside the skin and feathers, and you serve it as this whole bird to the table. And Martin wrote that if you want him, the peacock, to blow fire from the beak, you may put cotton and camphor soaked in aqua vitae or wine in the mouth of the bird and light it on fire. So there's also instructions to serve a fire-breathing peacock to the table. Additionally, as Platina is kind of like adding, editorializing the recipes that come from De Rossi too. At the end of one recipe he wrote, "When it is cooked, serve it to your enemies. There is nothing good in it," which is a pretty bleak burn too. So now we're going to go east again. We're going to go into India. The Nimatanama was written about 1500. And it was written by a ruler of a province within India, essentially. And it is a cookbook of delicacies. So again, we're still in this cooking for lords, flaming peacock style, men writing for men. But much like the Italian cookbook had a lot of the basis of modern Italian cuisine, in the Nimatanama, there are recipes for things that are going to sound familiar, like samosas, like raita, dal, lassi. And then there are also recipes in here that are a part of Indian cuisine today, but are very much credited, but have Persian roots and appear in this cookbook as such. Shorba, which really is just a Persian word that means soup. Sikh is kebabs, and biryani too, which is a big part of Indian culture as a whole, but also particularly Muslim Indian culture. And there's also sweets in here too, which I'm desperate to try. They're known as halvas. You might be familiar with halva, which is generally a sesame-based sweet, but the word halva in basically in Persian all the way back, it just means sweet. So it can be used to refer to any type of sweet. So in this book, there's a melon halva and a ginger halva. I haven't seen translations, so I don't know if these are just like candied fruits or if there's something else going on there. Another page from this gorgeous book. I love how so many of them are essentially illuminated manuscripts. This cookbook is really fascinating and exciting. It's from 1670. It was written by Lady Zhang Gai Hang, and she was kind of shockingly a very educated noblewoman. I say shockingly because in 17th century Korea, women were actively prevented from seeking out education. But her sort of family story goes that when her brothers were being educated, she would sit outside the door hiding so that she could learn to read and write as well. And she used this to write a cookbook of her children's favorite recipes when she got older and got married. The book title translates to Understanding the Taste of Food. All of these have these like very high like medical names too. There are 146 dishes on 30 pages. And of course, the original is this handwritten manuscript. There are several copies, but I believe only one of them is known about now because the book was intended to be passed to her daughters-in-law so that they could cook her son's favorite recipes. And basically then this handwritten manuscript got passed down through the family for the next 300 odd years. And it was in the early 2000s that one of her great grandsons was getting married and gave the family manuscript to his wife as tradition dictated. And she basically said, what is this? You know, the Korean was so old that it was basically unreadable. But she understood that they were recipes. And she began to, she collaborated with a university professional who understood this older form of Korean. And then they together were able to transcribe it. I don't think there is an English transcription yet, but there is also a restaurant in Korea that you can go to, and they cook recipes from this family cookbook. And the great like daughter-in-law is a big part of this process as well. So this is one of the recipes: a stewed chicken served with different types of pickles, with shaved egg, with shiso, which is a really beautiful herb that's also common in Japanese cooking, and little potatoes. And then I love this image as well. These are all of the different pickles that are mentioned in this book. And I would just really like to dig in. I see mustard greens, I see radishes, I see something that appears to be maybe a meat pickle, but maybe it's mushrooms. There's several types of mushroom pickles here. It's just a really exciting and fascinating book that I want to learn more about as well. And is believed to be the first book written by an Asian woman. And it is also the first book written by a woman that we've talked about. There was one earlier than this that came out of Germany. But so this is probably the second cookbook written by a woman in the world. But again, it was intended for the home. It was a home manuscript, a collection of recipes. And although those almost undoubtedly existed in other households, we don't have any examples. But that is about to shift from women writing for women in the household away from professional male cooks writing for other lordly professional male cooks. So speaking of that shift, let's begin to talk more about manuscripts. And we're going to kind of bring it home to America now and talk about our culinary culture here. The first cookbook wasn't published in America until 1796. So to understand what colonists and immigrants and indigenous people were eating before then, we often have to turn to manuscripts. Now, the one on the left here, the sort of big fat book, is an interesting one. It's known as Martha Washington's Book of Cookery, but Martha Washington did not write this book, and it was in no ways like a public publication until the modern day. She received this book on her wedding day to her first husband, Daniel Custis. George was her second husband. And this was a manuscript that had been passed down through their family, much like the Cury manuscript that we just talked about. And so every time someone got married, a new complete copy was made. So it's all sort of in the same handwriting, written at the same time. And the recipes are difficult to date because of that, but they span from the late Middle Ages to the early modern era, which is the 1800s. So contained in this one tome, there are recipes that sort of speak all the way back to the Forme of Cury, as well as things that feel very contemporary. And of course, so there's some European recipes, some English recipes in there as well. And then on the right side, this is a more modern manuscript. It's from probably the first decades of the 19th century. This belonged to the Lefferts, who were one of the earliest Dutch families in Brooklyn. And to give you an example, here's basically what recipes from these early manuscripts look like. This is one for New Year's cakes, which are cookies that would be passed out on New Year's Day to visitors. And the recipe goes 28 pounds flour, a lot of visitors coming, 10 pounds of sugar, 5 pounds of butter, caraway seed, and orange peel. That's the whole recipe. Now, caraway seed and orange peel are a delicious combination. I've made a version of this, but these manuscripts are almost like shorthand. They are either usually compiled when a daughter in the family is about to get married, or perhaps when the mother is ailing and is worried that she won't see her daughter get married. And then sometimes the inheritor continues it and writes recipes that are especially in the shorthand because the idea is you know how to cook. So there's a big shift happening in the 18th century between these professional male cooks and these female cooks who are now entering the public sphere and writing about their cooking at home. And as more female cooks, so also especially by the end of the 19th century, female cooks are employed in homes as opposed to men. That being said, there are still plenty of professional male cooks, especially in restaurants, and they tended to earn 3 times as much as women. But as far as the home, more and more people were hiring help, and usually that help were female servants, including the role of the cook. There is a little bit of like a cookbook war that happens in this time as well, which I think is really interesting. Basically the men are saying, stay out of our profession. This is our work. Yes, we understand that, you cook at home, but cooking publicly and professionally is usurping a profession that did not belong to them. This is especially when women were enrolling in professional cookery classes, both in France and America in the 19th century. The first Italian cookbook written by a woman, which was published not until 1900, if you can believe it. The author of that book claimed that male cooks had no care for the stomach or the purse of the person who paid him. She wrote that they cooked for the epicures and the gluttons rich enough to pay, while the female cooks were satisfied if the food was healthy, tasty, and did not cost a mint of money. So there's a little bit of a battle happening in who should be in these public spaces, where women are saying, we're the main cooks in our home. Why aren't we allowed to publicly write and discuss it? And the men are saying, this is money making, this is a profession, and you should stay out of it. Here are a couple early printed American cookbooks. On the far left, this is actually a British book, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass, even though it's only credited to by a lady at this time, because having a job just wasn't considered ladylike. So a lot of women would hide their names. This wasn't published in America, but it is the earliest cookbook that white colonists from England would have brought with them. And eventually the art of cooking, because it was popular in America, added an appendix that used American ingredients like squashes and gourds and corn and things like that. American Cookery, though, in the middle, that is our first published cookbook written by a woman named Amelia Simmons. As far as we can tell, no one is really sure if she existed. And it is a really important document of early American food. Yes, a lot of the paste, puffs, pies, tarts, puddings, and custards and preserves are very British influenced, but it also tells you how to prepare a turkey, essentially in the same way we do for Thanksgiving. The earliest recipe for pumpkin pie, cranberry sauce, and for Christmas cookies are all in this book as well. It also tells you how to slaughter and dress a sea turtle, and that recipe is about 4 pages long and looks a lot like the recipe that you see on the far right-hand side. American Cookery is from the 1790s. The Frugal Housewife is from the 1830s. It's written by a woman named Lydia Maria Child, who was also a big abolitionist too, and used a lot of the earnings from her work to not only support herself, but also to support the cause of abolitionists. And you can see what recipes look like in these published books. It's a recipe, but it's prose and it's advice as well. So like beer is a good family drink. A handful of hops to a pailful of water and a half pint of molasses makes good hop beer. Spruce mixed with hops is pleasanter than hops alone. Boxberry, feverbush, sweet fern, and horseradish make a good and healthy diet drink. And it just kind of goes on like that. It's not any one recipe. It's more like, I don't know, reading a magazine article. I also want to call out the Virginia Housewife. This is considered one of our earliest and most important regional cookbooks. This one came out in 1824 in Virginia. It's actually written by a niece by marriage of Thomas Jefferson. And again, at this point, we're getting into super regional cuisine, including rice in this case, which was a big part of cuisine in Virginia and the Carolinas as well. The earliest recipes for ice cream are in this book too. Regular flavors like vanilla, coconut, but also there is a recipe for oyster ice cream in this book too. The earliest cookbooks written by African Americans are coming out at this time as well. The House Servants Directory of 1827, written by a man named Robert Roberts, is considered to be the first published book of any kind written by a Black man. It is in a genre that was pretty common at that time, which is like advice to servants. Basically, more people, especially in America, that aren't in like lordly households are getting servants. And so these are books not necessarily to the head of those households on how to manage the servants, but basically to like the butler, the head servant, on how to manage the other servants. So there is practical advice. There are recipes, but also there are things in here. These are recipes that are like for the home, to recover a person from intoxication. Make the person that is intoxicated drink a glass of vinegar, woof, or a cup of strong coffee without milk or sugar, or a glass of hot wine. Any of those articles are a most safe and quick remedy to recover a person from intoxication. But there's also things like to whiten ivory that has been spoiled too. The first sort of full cookbook published by a Black woman in America is a domestic cookbook from 1866. This one, I believe, I don't want to give improper credit, but I believe this was discovered by cookbook writer Tony Tipton Martin, who has probably the largest collection of African American and Black American and Black immigrant cookbooks in this country. This was written by Melinda Russell, she was living in Paw Paw, Michigan, and she was trying to raise money to move back home in the South. Her book mostly focuses on baking recipes, which you see a lot in this time because baking is more complicated, takes more precision. So you find in the middle of the 19th century, in particular, things are weighted more towards baking recipes than cooking recipes. There are recipes like gingerbread, cream cake, which reads 1.5 cups sugar, 2 cups sour cream, 2 cups flour, 1 or 2 eggs, 1 teaspoon soda, flavor with lemon. Sounds pretty good. But there's also chicken soup, onion custard, recipes for preparing household items like cologne and shampoo. These are a couple cordials, so like fruit sweetened liqueurs, which is pretty fun. But what is really valuable about this book is that it's written in this Black woman's own voice, as opposed to cookbooks coming out of the South were written by white women who are watching their Black servants cook and then writing those recipes down. So because we have her voice, we also have her giving credit to the people that have taught her how to cook. She actually credits the Virginia Housewife, the book that we just looked at. Reading through that helped her learn how to cook, but also a woman named Fanny Stewart, who was essentially her mentor, a Black cook, who we just don't usually get to know about the people that were in the kitchens, particularly in the South, and making this amazing cooking. So even just having those names is really extraordinary. Mid-19th century, we see some of the first Jewish cookbooks as well. The very first one that's known is the Jewish Manual. We're hopping back across the ocean for a moment. This one is published in London in 1846. Interestingly, the woman who wrote it, Ms. Montefiore, she was Ashkenazic Jewish, but she married into an old Sephardic family in London. And so this cookbook also has not only the earliest Jewish recipes in print in English, but also the earliest Sephardic recipes. And recipes that were just broadly popular that would have suited a kosher diet. This, for example, is a soup miègre. A soup miègre is actually a Lenten soup, so a Christian soup, eaten during the Lenten fast when you're not supposed to be consuming meat. But since this having a meat-free dish is very handy for kosher, she includes this recipe. And also a lot of what she's saying is you can still cook kosher food in your home and have your non-Jewish friends over and they're still gonna love it. You can keep your traditions and still pass in London high society. So these are one of the Sephardic recipes, and these are little tarts. And then the middle is, so they're like butter tarts, and then the middle is egg and flaked coconut, and they're just really gooey and good. There's also recipes in here like for a lip balm that requires spermaceti, which is a substance harvested from the skull of a sperm whale. So there's food and there's practical home advice as well. In America, the earliest Jewish cookbook published here is by Esther Levy, although I recently discovered it's not totally true. Interestingly, there's a book from the 1860s called Jenny June's Cookbook that has a section of Jewish recipes, even though Jenny June wasn't Jewish herself. I think she was just trying to broaden her audience. But this is the first book that is dedicated to Jewish food. Some of the same ideas as Montefiore in that you can live in America, but and you can eat sort of modern trendy foods, but you can also maintain kosher and you can maintain your Jewish tradition. Esther Levy was probably a German Jew. We don't know a lot about her, but looking at the time period, that is where she would have come from. What you're looking at is a variation of Charlotte Russe, which is a very popular custardy layered dish, but this one was made for Passover. You can see it's made with matzah, and honestly, it was pretty gross. It's pretty much a sloppy mess. By the turn of the 20th century, we can see that really the shape of recipes are changing. Fannie Farmer wrote the Boston Cooking School Cookbook, which was published in 1896. And she didn't invent putting all your ingredients at the top of the recipe, but she really was the person to popularize it. Additionally, she was also known as the queen of level measurements. So Fannie Farmer actually taught and led the Boston Cooking School. At the end of the 19th century, less people can afford servants. So rather than guides that are going to your head servant to train him how to keep everybody else in check, now young wives are doing most of the cooking and housework themselves. Additionally, we're becoming a more industrialized and mobile society. So you might not be living close to mom to be able to get her help and her cooking tips. So cooking schools open across the country. And they're basically designed to teach young women how to cook food that looks like you have servants when you don't. But it also standardized recipes in a new way. You don't see like numbered instructions, but we do see the ingredients at the front. She's showing one of her students there a measuring cup. She's the reason that in America, we use volume measurements like cups as opposed to weight measurements like Europe does. Even though weight is more accurate, she just felt it was much easier for a housewife to acquire a measuring cup rather than a kitchen scale. So I think that really makes sense for the time. And that sort of leads into the idea of cookbooks as instructional. We did see that a little bit in the 19th century, like that conversation from the frugal housewife about beer. Beer is a good family drink. But in a book like Mastering the Art of French Cooking by Julia Child, she's really taking on the role of a teacher. Like, I didn't know anything. I learned it all. Come along with me. I'm going to explain it to you, and we're going to learn together. And revisiting this book, one of the things that I really marveled at was how it was sort of all laid out. In the earlier editions, she puts the ingredients on the left-hand side right next to the different steps in the recipe where you would need them. So as opposed to having to read the whole thing first to make sure you don't miss anything, you can sort of go along and cook it as you want. She also offers a lot of information, not only an introduction, but also a wine suggestion too. Her serving suggestions for 4 to 6 people. So it is a very thorough cookbook designed to train you to be a successful French chef. But we also get in the mid-20th century cookbooks that are sort of bucking the traditional recipe format. How to Cook a Wolf is MFK Fisher's book. The first edition came out in 1942, second came out in 1954. It's about cooking really good food when money is tight and times are tough. So it's really resonated again with me the past few years. And it is a cookbook, but it's also definitely a memoir too. So her recipes just appear in the middle of stories and they feel a lot more like a conversation. Even though it's standardized by having your ingredients at the top, even right away, she's saying a half-pound sausage or bacon or half a can of sardines. And then the instructions go like this: spread sausage or bacon or fish thin in pie pan or shallow casserole. Let heat in quick oven and pour off almost all fat. Leave oil on sardines. Make 1/2 usual baking powder biscuit, mixing with tomato sauce or meat stock. It's a question of flavors. One good combination with bacon strips is milk in the biscuit mix, plus a generous 1/2 cup of grated cheese instead of milk or water. It's like really sort of wild because also since this is the 1954 edition, she's sort of commenting in the text on her text. And so it's not straightforward at all, but it is kind of fun to read. The same as with the Moosewood cookbook. Now we're talking late 20th century, the famous vegetarian restaurant from Ithaca, New York. Again, like I love how it's not as, sometimes I feel modern recipes can be very restrictive. You have to make it this way. And I think that it gives new cooks a lot of anxiety, like, oh, I'm going to ruin it. But with this summer vegetable soup, you can see that there is a really, really long list of ingredients, but they're giving different options like fresh or dried thyme. But also, since this is just supposed to be a soup of whatever is growing in your garden, I love the little other possibilities around the corner, around the edges of the recipe. Snippets of early green beans, summer squash, a variety of fresh herb snippings, especially basil and marjoram. So it's just a little bit more relaxed. Cooking is more like a conversation than an order or an instruction. And we also, in the 20th century, begin to see cookbooks that are dedicated to activism. Now, I didn't get into it, but you also, the first sort of activist related cookbooks really come out during the suffrage era. So 19 teens, sort of leading up to the ratification of women's suffrage. And interestingly, there was so much fundraising done for abolition in the middle of the 19th century. It seems like there should be some like abolition cookbooks. Certainly it was very much tied to food. People who were abolitionists would refuse to use slave produced products like white sugar. But as far as I've been able to find, and other scholars have been able to find so far, there's no examples. There are quite a few women's suffrage cookbooks to both raise money and raise awareness of the cause. And then during the civil rights movement, you see a lot more diversity in terms of what causes are being represented. So this is the People's Philadelphia cookbook, which was only recently rediscovered, like in a musty flea market box. And luckily, the person searching recognized what it was. This represented an organization that would raise money and fund local activist organizations, everything from like Farm Workers United to the Black Panthers. And so this was a collection of recipes from all of the other organizations that they had helped. So there is like Puerto Rican sofrito in here. There's also a recipe called a very gay meatloaf too, because they funded gay activism as well. So it was to fundraise and was incredibly popular in the time, but it is also probably the earliest cookbook that really embraces the diversity of America. And because it's working with all these activism groups, is showing recipes and cooking from so many different cultures within our country. Here's a couple examples. Here's the Puerto Rican bean stew. You can see there's beef stew, American. Also in the mid-20th century, in addition to activism cookbooks, we see the first cookbooks by authors who are identifying openly as LGBTQ. The earliest queer cookbook is generally considered the Alice B. Toklas cookbook. Alice B. Toklas was Gertrude Stein's partner, which interestingly in her writing, she always referred to as Gertrude Stein, not Gertrude. And, you know, the book is sort of about their friendship, but everyone knows that they were a couple. It's just still very much an older era where that is sadly not acknowledged. This contains Toklas's recipes as well as recipes collected from their friend group. So even though her writing isn't outwardly queer, it's sort of how it's read. It's the subtext of her relationship with Gertrude Stein. And oddly, this is the first book that it contains a recipe for a pot brownie, or at least that's how it's generally referred to. But in reality, it's more like a pot trail mix. Not that I would know. There it is. Hashish fudge is what she would call it, which it's also not a fudge. There's no chocolate involved. There's lots of spices. There are dates, dried figs, shelled almonds, peanuts. So it is, you know, very healthy. There's a lot of fiber. And you'll also get high if you want. Just about a decade later, the gay cookbook comes out. Again, this is civil rights era. A lot of the laws that were restricting LGBTQ culture are being struck down. And so one of the ways to normalize gay culture was to mix it with camp. When I say camp, think John Waters, but it's this certain type of very out humor that's really over the top too. There's a lot of puns. It was written by Lou Rand Hogan, who is an openly gay chef. It's a little provocative. And this was published by a major publisher. I believe this came out with Harper. And it was this idea of gays are safe and campy. This is domestically gay. This isn't like hiding out in parks and being arrested. This is, hey, we are normal people and we love to throw a party too. Here are a couple of the recipes. You can see even illustrations are really, really cute. It's described as this is for gay men, happy, joyful, and not threatening. That was really the goals of what they were trying to get across too. But there is just a lot of fun in the writing, like this "oh behave" moment under the recipe for fruit salad. And so let's take a moment to look at a couple contemporary cookbooks and see how far we've come. On one hand, we've got the Food Lab, and on the other, we've got Indianish. These are both cookbooks that have come out within the past 6 years, I would say. The Food Lab is written by Kenji Lopez Alt, and it is a very, very precise and particular cookbook. Kenji was first at America's Test Kitchen, and then he was at Serious Eats. And his whole thing is really analyzing, why do we cook something a certain way? Is there a better way to do it? And so when you look at his recipes online and a lot of recipes in this book, he describes not only how to do something, but why we do it. Like what chemical changes are occurring to make this food more delicious. And if he finds that the old way of doing something doesn't actually serve the recipe, he finds the best way to do it. So this is extremely precise. There's everything is very carefully measured. There's no suggestions along the side like in the Moosewood cookbook. All of the instructions are very specific and very, very thorough too. So this is sort of one type of cookbook, I would say, science-minded, very precise, very specific, designed to experiment, but also to learn and to give you these very, very strict parameters of what will make a good recipe. On the flip side of that, we've got Priya Krishna's cookbook, Indianish, and it's basically about her growing up in America with Indian parents and the food that she and her mom in particular would cook at home. So there's some very traditional dishes in here, traditional to her culture back home. But of course, with any immigrant family, there's all kinds of adoptions and adaptations and fun new creations. Like, for example, this roti pizza. Roti being a very traditional flatbread, but kind of turning it into pizza, an American dish. And what I love about her cookbook is that there is a lot of room for adaptation. Like, for example, in this, she gives you 2 recipes, one for chutney cheddar pizza, one for potato rosemary pizza. But also on the front of her book, she explains all of the ingredients and spices that might be unfamiliar, and also tells you where you can get them and what they taste like and what they do for a recipe, but also then gives you an alternative too. So if you can't find it or you're intimidated by it, you can use something more familiar. There is a lot of flexibility, but encouragement of try this, you'll like it, give it a whirl. It's really, really worth it. So I love the way she writes too. Love both of these authors. And that, in a nutshell, is our entire history of cookbooks and recipes.